All right, welcome. We're at chapter 49. Only, I think, two more to go, if I'm not mistaken, in the text, but we'll cover those when we come to them. This chapter is one that's a little bit more North Carolina centric than some of the others, primarily because property law, and the title of this chapter is Real Property and Landlord Tenant Law. So, property law, which is its own distinct area of the law, sometimes called real property law, is very old, among the oldest of the common law, uh, among the best developed, in part, I think, because land was the primary measurement of wealth and the most important thing for several centuries when the common law is developing in the 1200s and when society is becoming a little bit more sophisticated. So there's a lot of unique rules that we're not even going to touch on, but that exist inside property. It is its own branch, and there are attorneys that spend most of their lives inside this branch of the law. So, first and foremost, let's talk about what it is, the nature of real property. Okay, well, if you think about a piece of property sitting on the surface of the earth, um, there's lots of things that go into this. Now, there's the dirt that your feet are stepping on, but also there's what's underneath. The soil that's underneath you, the ore, the minerals. And since we live in a sphere, and I know there's a few people that debate this, but since we live on a sphere, um, you essentially own a cone shape all the way to the center of the earth. And then if you look above you, you own the from the surface, from the dirt, to the skies. So we recognize this, and some of the older deeds you'll see things like from the bowels of the earth to the vaults of the heavens, which I think is some pretty nice poetry. But basically, you own this kind of conical shape of land. Now, there's also some other things that aren't even addressed here that can be pretty important, like water rights. Do you own the stream that flows onto your property? What can you do with that stream? If you own a piece of property on the coast, how much how much of the property do you own? Because some of the time it's flooded. So do you own to the high water mark, to the low water mark? Does it vary depending upon is the tide in and the tide out? And different states have come up with different approaches to title rights. Some of which says you can't own anything that's flooded, and then of course there's riparian rights, which is just the rights to water, which is not as important in North Carolina as it is in some states like um, the western states, Colorado, California is very important. California, much of it is semi-arid, so controlling water is very important there. One of the things that we also have, and I just throw these in, is you'll sometimes come across some very odd measurements for description, some of which we recognize. Like if I say it's a yard, you'll see that in some old descriptions. Well, we're used to knowing, since we use the imperial system, that a yard is 3 feet. But you'll also sometimes hear links, which is 2/3 of a foot, 66%. A rod, which is 16.5, so you might have something that's 32 rods long. Um, Also, rods are called poles or perches. A grunter's chain, an engineer's chain, you can see those are 66 or 100 feet. Um, a statutory mile or a nautical mile are both used. So you do have to pay attention to the way in which you're measuring. And, you know, we're the last important country that is not using as our routine system of measurement. We're still using the old imperial system. We're the last ones not using the metric system, which I would assume at some point will probably be dragged kicking and screaming into the metric system, but not yet. Um, and this can have some repercussions. I'm reminded, of course, this is the week that you're probably listening to this lecture either almost close to when I recorded, or it might be the next semester. This is the week where the Mars probe landed, and we've had Mars probes malfunction because American engineers didn't convert from the metric to the imperial system and back and forth. So we've had some accidents happening on Mars because of our old adherence. Okay, this is a quick description of property. Now you'll notice that it says point of beginning. You have to pick a point where you start your description, because what you've got to do is build a box. And then sometimes it'll say this is the lot, low lot elevation, which is the lowest point in the lot as well. Sometimes you'll see that, and they'll give a dimension of it. They'll also give you the total acreage of it, and this is 0.46, or just about half an acre. So it starts at 1, and then it's usually said to run. So it'll run north 16 degrees, 42 minutes, 22 seconds west, and it'll go 168.14 feet. It goes down to a point. And then it will run south 89 degrees, 13 minutes, 29 seconds west for 156, and then you can see the other two. I won't bother reading them. You're quite capable of it. And you can see it forms a box. So all descriptions like this generally will form boxes so that we know what land we're talking about. Now, as I said, you do have the rights to the air above you and what's below. Now, in the past, no one thought too much about the air rights. It was essentially unlimited. Everybody recognized you could build as high as you wanted. Now, before the 20th century, this isn't too much of an issue because we could only build so high, and more importantly, we didn't have planes. Now, if we had kept the old idea that you owned everything above you, that it was owned just like everything below you, well, then you could never fly a plane over the land, because obviously you'd be trespassing every time you flew. Now, we have place limits. We say that the air above you is only yours so far as you can build into it, and that can be limited by zoning and things like that. Subsurface rights are your rights to enter a land, and entering is sometimes called a profit. Sometimes you'll hear the term profit apprendi, and often to remove minerals, ores. So I used to practice in Mitchell County, North Carolina. Mitchell County, North Carolina was famous, or infamous if you like, for kaolin, which is a very fine type of clay that's used in the production of china, and feldspar, which is now mainly an industrial chemical. So very often people would sell the right, while retaining the use of the property on the surface. They'd sell the right to someone else, or give the right to someone else, to remove kaolin or feldspar. Plants and vegetations and land. Now, the general rule here is that all plant life is considered real property when it's in the ground. When you sell the land goes with the plant go with the land. If you cut them off, if you harvest them, now you've converted it from real property to personal property, which we talked a little bit about in the last chapter. When we describe a piece of land, we usually use terms to describe your ownership. So, and the peculiarities of your ownership. Most of the time when people think about land, and the best way to get it, where you own everything, is called a fee simple. In North Carolina, we usually use the term fee simple absolute. It means you, and you alone, own all the land now and forever in the future till you sell it. Another way, and this is sometimes called the poor man's will in North Carolina, is a life estate. And this is when someone owns the property so long as they're alive. Now, you can create these. That's why it's kind of called a life estate. So let's suppose that you want your spouse to have the land. Let's suppose your spouse's name is John Doe. And you say, okay, I want John Doe to have the land so long as he's alive. But when he's dead, I want it to go to my children, maybe by my first marriage, Ken Hogue. Okay, so the transfer, the deed would read to John Doe for life. This is creating the life estate. And upon his death, to my son of my first marriage, Ken Hogue. Okay, so what you've done there is, so long as John Doe is alive, he can live on the land. He can actually sell the right to be on the land to anybody else, but only as long as he's alive. The second he dies, Ken Hogue, the son from the first marriage, gets the land. Now, the person that holds the land during this time can use it, but there are limits. They're not allowed to, strip mine it, to commit what's called waste or wastage. And they only control it. So they basically should leave the property in relatively good repair or good condition. This is a picture of a fee simple absolute deed. And you'll notice over on this side, you would have, on the side to the left, I'm not sure you get to see the arrow I use, but on the side to the left, you'll see where it says estate tax and recording time, and there is a grantor, the person who gives the deed, and a grantee, the person who receives it. So there, you're just selling it. John Doe sells it to Mary Smith. On the other side, you've got the life estate. That's when you have to say, I'm giving John Doe a life estate, and then you have to tell me who has the right to it after they're dead. You don't see life estates as much anymore because much of estate planning can be done a little more formally. All right, now we also have instances of concurrent ownership, and you're going to have a chart about this in a moment, but so we'll talk about the three that exist in North Carolina, one that doesn't, but exists in some other states. Tenants in common, joint tenants, and tenants by the entirety. Okay, so let's look at tenancy in common. This is when two or more people own a piece of land together, but the other people owning the land have no claim on it if a person dies. So it's kind of like this. We decide that we want to buy a piece of property as an investment together. That's me and three friends, A, B, and C. So A, B, C, and me. It sounds like a song. A, B, C, and me get together and decide that we're going to buy. Usually when we talk about land, for whatever reason, in legal text you always call it green acre or black acre. I'm not really sure. I don't think there's any racial connotations there, but black acre seems to be the common. I think it probably descends from a very famous legal scholar called Black or Blackston, but that's just a guess. So let's suppose A, B, C, and me, the four of us, own it as tenants in common. If A dies, we, B, C, and me, do not get any rights to his property. It all goes to his heirs. So he might have had a wife. And if C dies, and she's a woman, she might have had a husband. So it goes directly to them. It doesn't go to us. That's somewhat common in business. Now, a joint tenancy is a little bit different. A joint tenancy is they own the property together, A, B, C, D, but when one of them dies, the property passes to the others. Now, this is, sometimes you'll see it with siblings. They get a piece of property from their parents, and their parents might say, I bequeath this to our children, A, B, C, D, as joint tenants. In that case, as each sibling dies, the other siblings inherit their share. It's not terribly common to see these, but they do exist. And if you don't like it, you're one of the siblings, you say, well, I want my money, I want out of here. You can actually say, well, I want to convert this from a joint tenancy to a regular old fee simple absolute. I want it divided or partitioned, and I want my percentage, and I'm going to sell it. So you can essentially end this right to get the property after death. Now, one that's far more common, and is the way that my wife and I own property, and that most married couples own property, because it's the presumptive type of property if it's a husband and wife, is called tenants or tenancy by the entirety. If you convey property to a husband and wife, this is how we assume they have it. So it's like a joint tenancy, But, and here's an important thing, neither party can be forced to sell any part of the property for a partition or division. So if a husband or a wife came into the marriage owing a huge debt, and they now own a piece of property as joint tenants, and the creditors of the husband or wife comes and say, well, we want our money, and the other spouse says, well, I don't owe you any money. And they said, yeah, but you own this nice piece of property, Green Acre, that's worth $100,000. If you sell it, you can clear your spouse's debt. Well, they can't compel you to sell this. And I've seen this happen a couple times even with IRS liens, where one spouse has a big debt and the IRS can't compel them, even though they own a nice piece of property, to sell a piece of property. Sometimes this can be used essentially as a tool to get other people to settle, because you can say, well, you know, I'm married, I've probably been married for 20, 30 years, you won't get a dime till then, unless you want to take X amount of money now. If the spouses get divorced, or they can agree, or one of them dies, that's the end of it all. Now, community property is not really used much in North Carolina. It's not used at all as far as I know. You do get certain rights upon marriage, but we don't call it community property. Essentially, each partner owns an equal right in all the property that you acquire during marriage. It's a presumptive type. It is a little bit how it works in North Carolina, but we don't call it community property. Okay, you're going to get a chart in the next slide, and hold on, there we are. And it breaks out how you own it, what's your right of survivorship, is there unity, is there estate language, how is it created, what's the method that it ends, and how does the property pass. Okay, leasehold estates. Let's talk about something that many of us have experienced, and this is we rented a piece of land, more likely an apartment. So when a landlord, who's called the lessor, conveys the property to the lessee or the tenant, he has a lease or a leasehold. Now, very often it is either a tenancy for years or periodic tenancies, and those things are very important, are very close to each other, and most of the time it doesn't matter how you classify it. A tenancy for years, you get it for a specific time. Like, this is how most, I would say, that you rent an apartment. Like, you get it for a year or 6 months. You lease it for a specific period of time. Periodic, there's no set time, but there are set payment periods. So termination of a periodic tenancy is, you know, I'll make 3 payments every 3 months. I'll make a payment, you know, for 9 months. So that'd be a periodic tenancy. Not as common. Tenancy at will, this is essentially you stay on the property as long as I want you there and as long as you want to stay. So this lets you leave whenever you want. Tenancy at sufferance is when you're on someone's land without the right, and very often someone who's there and you're trying to evict them. We call them tenants at sufferance. We also have non-possessory interest, and the primary ones here are easements and profits. An easement, most people think of an easement as your right to enter a person's property and cross over it. There can be more extensive easements than that. It can be things like a utility easement where they have a right to run a utility line over your property or underneath your property. A profit is to go in and make use of it. So if you get a ticket to go into Disney World, that's a profit in many ways, although I'm not positive Florida calls it that. So easements are usually either easements appurtenant or easements in gross. An easement appurtenant is when the right is tied to another piece of land. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to speed forward here for a second to show you a picture. Okay, so if you'll look at this, you've got a dominant and a servient estate on here. So if you were to create this, you would have lot A, lot B, and you can see lot one only gets to the public road by driving over the servient tenement. You also can have an easement by necessity. You've got the dominant one there. Let me back up here. Okay, so appurtenant, it's tied to another piece of property. That would be like that map, either for the bigger or the smaller piece of property. An easement in gross is simply, it's not tied to a property, it's tied to a person. You might give the permission to someone to cross your property. You might say, well, I know you got a hunting lodge up there and you could take the old public road, but, I really like you, John Boy, so here you go. Here is an easement in gross. You can drive over my land when you want to get to your cabin. I'm not giving it to anybody else. I'm just giving it to you. Now, easements can be created by deeds. So sometimes you see them recorded. They can be created by wills. They can be created by a contract, particularly an easement in gross. They can be created by implication. So that illustration going forward, let me go forward one more. If let's suppose lot 1 and lot 2 had been one single lot, and you decided, well, I'm gonna break these apart and sell one. But once you do that, it's an implication that since lot 1 can't get to the public road any other way, that, let me back up, that you're creating it by implication. And of course, it's also a necessity. If the only way to get out is by crossing, and this can be even an elevation thing. If I build an apartment and you're on the 4th floor, and there's the only way to get to the 1st floor and get out of the apartment is to cross my land, you've got an easement by necessity. You also, and this is a little bit rarer, can create an easement by prescription, where you essentially do something long enough. In the typical language, North Carolina, this is one of those North Carolina specific things, it's 21 years. So if for 21 years you act like there's an easement, the law eventually will say, okay, there's an easement. When you sell land that benefits, the easement passes with it. When you sell land that's burdened, the easement passes with it. The easiest way to get rid of an easement is to turn it back to the owner of the burdened land. Say, okay, I don't want it anymore. Or you can merge the properties, or you can abandon the easement. Now, I also referred to a license or profit. They're very similar to each other, and different states call them different things. But that's the right to get into someone's land. And again, as a profit or a license is like a ticket to an amusement park. Okay, we've already talked about that slide. All right, so let's talk about how we transfer property, listing agreements. And we got one coming up, a picture of it. But a listing agreement is when you decide you're going to sell your property and you get a real estate agent or realtor to agree to sell it. And you're going to pay a commission. And now you're going to sign a contract, and it can be fairly sophisticated. But this is going to usually give them the exclusive right, although I would hold back. I would say that you got to let me, if I can, privately sell it. If someone comes to me and says, hey, John, I hear you want to sell your house, I'll buy it. You may want to put that provision in. They may not take it. Real estate contracts, if you're actually going through with it, so not listing your property for sale, but the actual sale, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not just the price of the property, but what's included, what type of deeds, what warranties and exclusions. Here is a copy of the standard North Carolina listing agreement, and you'll notice it's going to give a description of the property in that, and I'll let you look at that. The real estate contract itself will often have contingencies. The most common contingency would be that you can get a conforming loan in X amount. So usually there has to be a examination of the property. You're going to buy the property for $100,000. The bank sends someone out and says, yep, it's worth $100,000. And then let's suppose you and I'm able to get a loan against that property at 3%. If you can't get a 3% loan, you don't have to buy the property. There's often a deposit, earnest money that's deposited. There are, in most states, North Carolina included, that new homes are fit for human habitation, although standards do vary dramatically. And sellers do have a duty to disclose defects of the property. The level of it varies by state. North Carolina is not great about disclosing it, but if there is an important problem that would be difficult to discover, you often have a duty to disclose it. So if your property is been insulated with asbestos, you might have a duty to disclose that. Now it's got to be a real thing. If I remember reading a lawsuit once where someone sued because the seller didn't disclose the house was haunted. It's not a real thing. So it makes for a good movie or TV show, but there's no such thing as ghosties. So you wouldn't have to disclose that Casper lives there. The deed. Now, remember, we kind of started this with a description of the deed, and if you remember, the deed is going to define the land. It's called an instrument of conveyance. It's going to have the name of the grantor. That's the terminology we use, and that's important because if you go down to the North Carolina Register of Deeds, they have used to be a physical book. Now a lot of it's done electronically. What was called the grantor index, and they had a grantee index. So they recorded the deed in two places: who was selling it, the grantor, and who was buying it, the grantee. That way, when you were looking up a deed, you say, okay, John Doe sold it to Mary Jane. So Doe gets recorded, Jane gets recorded. Now why is that important? Because then if you're trying to find out if Mary Jane sold it later, you now go to the grantor book after that date and you search for Jane. You have to have words that show conveyance. You got to legally describe the land. That's usually meets and bounds. You have to sign it and you deliver the deed. Now the next thing is you've got to record that deed. And there are really three options. Well, let me back up. The deed itself is usually in North Carolina, a general warranty deed or a warranty deed. And this offers a number of promises, essentially saying that I'm conveying good title. You can have special warranty deeds that say, I don't know what went on before me. I just got the property this year. I know some crazy people owned it before me. But I promise, well, I owned it in this last year. I didn't do anything. I didn't take out a mortgage or anything that you don't know about. You can also have a quick claim or a quiet claim deed. It goes by different names in different locations. Quick claim deed says, I'm going to give you whatever I have, but I may have no claim to it. I can give you a quick claim deed to the Statute of Liberty right now. Grant deeds are same as special warranty. Sheriff's deeds you don't see much at all, but essentially they're usually issued after foreclosure. Now, getting back to recording, I said I was going to jump back in here. You've got the deed in your hand. When does it become your property? Well, you have to let the world know that you have the land. So there's really three options. One is, let's suppose that I sell the property to three different people. And I write out three different deeds. I sell it to A, I sell it to B, I sell it to C. One option is you run down to the courthouse, and the first one of A, B, or C to record that deed, to give it to the Register of Deeds, get it entered in the grantor grantee index, they own the property now. That's called a pure race jurisdiction. And North Carolina actually uses that standard. Whoever gets there first, it's theirs. Now, there can be a lawsuit from B and C, and you can have a big fight about this. That's fine. But A has got the land. Then there's a pure notice jurisdiction. If A gets it, and B and C knows that they got it, then B and C are out of luck. And then there's notice and race. Do you know, and is it recorded? There's only one state left in the United States that's a pure race jurisdiction, and you're living in it. That's North Carolina. Most of the rest of the states are notice and race or pure notice. Okay, a couple other ways you can get land, of course, is you can get land or property by a will. People can die. It's kind of short and sweet. We do have a chapter coming up in inheritance on this, but the other way you can get it is adverse possession. Now, adverse possession kind of goes back to something I talked a little bit about before when I was talking about easements. Adverse possession means that you squat on someone's land. You take exclusive control over it. You do this openly. You do it continuously with peace. It's not beating someone. It's adverse to their interests. They haven't agreed to it, essentially. And you hold it for 21 years. At that point, it becomes your land. Very rare. Very, very rare. Eminent domain is when the government needs your land for a public purpose. So let's suppose that we need to build an Air Force base. The government might come to you and say, well, you got a nice flat piece of land here. We're trying to build an Air Force base. We need it. When the government has the right to do this, or it could be we want to build a highway, or we want to build a new waste dump, whatever. There are some problems here. Now, sometimes it's obvious that the government's taking your land, but sometimes they put so many restrictions on your land you can't use it. So suppose they said, you can keep your land, we don't want to buy it, we don't want to spend the money, but you can't ever develop it. If they put so many restrictions on it that the land essentially becomes worthless, courts have begun to recognize that that is in fact a taking and you got to pay the person. So usually what happens is the state comes to you and says, we're condemning the land. Now usually it's not done formally. They usually come to you and say, we're going to take the land. We want it because we want to build this highway. And here's what we're willing to pay. Now, you may not agree with that. If you don't like the price, you have to appeal it, and there's a process, but usually you're going to lose, I'll be honest with you. And at the end of the day, it gets transferred to the state. Zoning is a way in which the state can control land without the formality of annexing it. And usually a property is going to be zoned R for residential, C for commercial, I for industrial, or mixed use. You can mix in those. Some states have a lot of zoning. Some areas in those states have a lot of zoning. Cities tend to have a lot of zoning. Some cities don't. One of the reasons that you have such bad flooding issues in Texas and in Houston is there's no zoning. So what they've done is they've paved over almost all their green areas, and they've filled in a lot of their what would be abatement, the ways in which the land can absorb water, so that if they get a lot of water in Houston, it's going to flood. So zoning, using police power is a little bit cheaper, so you can have laws on public health, safety, morals, general welfare. You can have a zoning that says, we're not going to annex this, but you can't use it for anything but commercial development or residential development. You can get a variance to zoning where you say, I want to use the land for something else, and that's got to be available as a kind of process. This is more common in cities when people want to often convert something from residential to commercial or commercial to residential. Building permits, again, tend to be weaker in the south and the west than they are in the north and the central United States. But the state can use them really to compel people to build things or even demolish them. And there's few limits on them so long as they substantially advance a legitimate state interest. One of the big fights we saw in North Carolina recently was, can we mandate that people have sprinklers inside their larger than residential homes? And there have been a lot of exceptions to this, but that's breaking down pretty much. You've got to have a sprinkler system installed any place where people live or work in great numbers. Okay, restrictive covenants. Let's talk a little bit about restrictive covenants. Now these have an old and somewhat torturous history, but basically they're used to privately do what zoning does publicly. They place limits on what you can do. Very often if you buy in a subdivision, they'll build restrictive covenants, and it'll say things like, you can only use this home for residence. You can't establish a business here. They run with the land. They've got to be written. You've got to be presented with them when you buy it. They have to concern land. There's got to be notice. You can't put limits on things like race, color, religion, or national origin. If that happens, if we have a restriction, for example, if you looked at some old deeds here in Raleigh, you would see restrictive covenants. I've seen a few that read, and they have pretty offensive language. They'll say things like, you cannot sell this land to a member of the Negroid, Mongoloid, or Hebrew race. And obviously that's not legal. So we would strike that part of the restrictive covenant or sometimes all of that restrictive covenant down. Let's talk about leases now. A lease is this underlying contractual relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So you should state, now basically it's got to be written, but and almost all leases are written. You should state it's a lease. You should say that the tenant is coming in to take possession, that the landlord has the right to get it back afterwards, and this is what I'm leasing. Usually it's an apartment, like apartment 4A or 6B. And then indicate the terms of the lease. Is it going to be for a year? Is it going to be for 6 months? How long is it going to be? What are you going to pay? Those are the big two things. You can put other stuff in there as well. Again, much like the sale of land and the restrictive covenants, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or gender. So let me just step back here for a second, because there's been some contention lately about, well, can I sell to who I want to sell to or not sell to who I want to? The answer there is no. When you enter the marketplace, you agree that you will sell your goods or services, and this is going to include land, to all willing buyers. You can't refuse to deal with someone because of their race, their color, their religion, their national origin. Now, you can refuse to sell them if they don't have the money. And there are some limits we can put for age. We'll talk about that in 1 second. But basically, you've got to sell to people. And I guess now we're getting ready to add to that list of people you can't discriminate on as to sexual orientation. And this is a big fight because it's not a recognized federally protected class by statute. You can have limitations where you can say below certain ages you can't sell. And usually these are limitations based upon age. If you want a senior's home, you're allowed to protect it to a certain age. Those we recognize. UCC 2-302 bars contracts that are grossly unethical or unfair, making them illegal. This is a very high standard. You typically don't see these in real estate very often, but it can happen where people get a little happy. A little unhappy, rather, excuse me. Right of possession. The landlord should deliver physical possession, and he guarantees quiet enjoyment, that no one's going to dispute title. If he doesn't, it's a violation of the lease by him. If the landlord fails in his duties, what can happen? Well, there can be what's called constructive eviction, where he's essentially gotten to the point where he's kicked the tenant out. If the landlord doesn't like what the tenant's doing, but the tenant hasn't breached it, he may try to retaliate and kick him out. Both of those are illegal. Use of premises, basically absent provisions in the contract that are different or the lease that are different, you can use them for any legal purposes. You're not allowed to commit wastage. You're not allowed to rip the carpet up and burn it. You can't alter the basic nature of the leasehold without permission of the landlord, and you can't create a civic nuisance. Statutorily, you have to maintain health and safety standards. You've got to repair damage not caused by the tenants, although not so much in North Carolina. Do realize that North Carolina has a relatively weak landlord-tenant system. In some states, it's very strong. In some states, you can even withhold money if the landlord doesn't do what he's supposed to. You can go on a rent strike and they can't kick you out. Not North Carolina. So there is an implied warranty of merchant of habitability. Now, North Carolina has these certainly for new homes, but it's not very strong. What the court will do in North Carolina and most states is they'll look at a leasehold and they'll say, okay, was the defect or problem caused by the tenant? Well, if that's the problem, we'll kick this lawsuit out. How long has it existed? Did it exist when he got the property? What's the age of the building? What's the impact on health and safety? Is there a violation of housing, building, sanitary standards? All of those can impact. That's why when local jurisdictions like cities, sometimes counties, pass health and safety regulations or zoning, they can have an impact on landlord or tenant. Remedies for breach of the lease. Now, as I said, in some states you can withhold your rent, not North Carolina. Okay. You can sue for damages, that should be, excuse me, not from damages. Rent, let me back up there. And of course, obviously, you can break the lease. Let me just change that to 4 there. Okay, you can break the lease, obviously. Okay, let's advance. The landlord has a duty, of course, to mitigate his losses. If he rents an apartment for a year and a month in the tenant leaves, he can't simply lock the door and say, I'm going to collect the next 11 months' rent. He has to go out and make it a good faith effort to rent the apartment as soon as possible. If he rents it in 3 months, then his damages are limited to those 3 months and any costs associated with finding that new tenant. What about security deposits and late charges? Those are both legal, and they can withhold them to cover property damage. Basically, there are some in North Carolina requirements that they give you notice they're going to keep it. If you make a demand and they don't reply within 30 days, then you have a right to get the money back. But if they give you a notice that they're going to keep the security deposit, they can do it absent you going to court. When the tenant doesn't pay, North Carolina, some states let the landlord get a lien. You don't see that much in North Carolina. You do see lawsuits where you see breaches, and you obviously see, I want the land back since you're not paying the apartment. Landlord's liabilities for injuries. What happens when the landlord doesn't take care of the premises and someone's hurt? Or he takes care, but someone's hurting the property. Well, there's really 3 options. Was someone asked onto the property, invitee, for the benefit of the person who owns it? Were they asked onto the property for the benefit of the person entering it, or are they a trespasser? So who's benefiting and why they're in? Each party has a different standard of care. If you're there because were invited on and it's for my benefit, then I have the highest duty of care to take care of you. If you trespass onto the land, I have the lowest duty of care, and the others in between. Landlords are liable usually just for the common areas and for known defects. They do have a duty to inspect if it's commercial property. And since they maintain or retain control over the common areas, that's where their liability flows. The landlord must keep the premises fit and safe. Renters are not allowed to withhold rent. There are no rent control laws in North Carolina. Written leases usually are for 12 months or more very often, and landlords can withhold security deposits without notice or 30 days after notice. Generally, we follow state law here, and again, landlord tenant laws are pretty weak in North Carolina. You have the implied warranty of habitability, again, fairly weak. There are local, state, and health codes, city, county. If a third party comes onto it and commits crime, there may be some liability if it's on the common areas where the landlord. So let's suppose it's a front door that should have had a lock and the lock's been broken for 6 months, and someone comes in and commits a robbery or an assault. Landlord may have some liability there. And very often landlords will put these exculpatory clauses in saying they have no liability, but they can get struck down. Tenants' liability, they have to keep up regular maintenance. And it's commercial, they have to keep any place that the public may come onto the landlord's land to shop or do something safe. Okay, transferring this property. Just a couple more slides and we're done. It's a longer one than I like. If the landlord sells the property, then the tenant becomes the new owner's tenant. It doesn't end the lease. And this is called a right of landlord's reversion. Now, what about if the tenant wants to sell the land or his leasehold? Well, usually they have that right unless, and this is usually in the contract, the lease says you can't do this. Now, there's an assignment where I want out of this completely. I don't want to be responsible anymore. Here's 100% of my interest. It's a 12-month lease. Here's 12 months. Then there's subleases where it said, well, I don't want to be in this apartment for 6 months because I'm going to Paris. So for the next 6 months, you will sublease it from me. Now, very often there is forfeiture restraint, which says you can't, or these are the conditions under which you can do this. In both of those, the original tenant typically is still responsible to the landlord for all this. Okay, last point before I let you all go. If there's a lease and you get to the end of the statutory period, the landlord generally does not have to send notice, although the state, city, county may require it. If the landlord sells the property to the tenant, you have a merger of interests and the lease is over because now you've just got one owner. The landlord and the tenant may agree that you're just going to end the lease and you're going to end it early. The equal dignity rule, remember, which requires certain things to be in writing, may apply here. Finally, renewal, usually notice by the tenant is required to physically renew. Okay, a little bit longer than I like. I like to keep it in a half hour, but we went to 46 minutes. But that's the end. 2 more to go, and I will see you for the next chapter whenever you're ready.